So even today, as we continue our study on the Ten Commandments, okay, I'm going to start with the worship song.
All to Jesus I surrender, all to Thee I freely give. I will ever love and trust You in Your presence daily live. I surrender all. I surrender all to Thee, my blessed Savior. I surrender all. All to Jesus I surrender, Lord. I give myself to Thee. Fill me with Your love and power. Let Your blessing fall on me. I surrender all. I surrender all to Thee, my blessed Savior. I surrender all. All to Jesus I surrender now. I feel Your sacred flame. Oh, the joy of full salvation. Glory, glory to Your name. I surrender all. I surrender all to Thee, my blessed Savior. I surrender all. I surrender all. I surrender all. I surrender all to Thee, my blessed Savior. I surrender all to Thee, my blessed. All to Thee, my blessed Savior, I surrender all.
Okay, I hope that song brings back good memories to you. Okay. So even as we continue to study the Ten Commandments, okay, I shared with you on Monday, okay, the whole area, why some people don't want to study the Ten Commandments. I think our brother Henry reviewed it yesterday. That Dave Paulson says that these are just rules and regulations, and now we are adults, we don't need them. That they are too negative. Okay, we should be more positive in our affirmation. They object to absolute morality. There's no such thing of absolute as such. That they're old-fashioned and out of date. There's Jewish, but we are not Christians now. Why must you keep Jewish commands? Now we're under grace and not under law. Okay, so why must you keep in the way of the legalistic part of it? And lastly, love is all we need, or what Dave Paulson says, loveism. So today I'm going to share with you the next 7 reasons why people ought to study the Ten Commandments. Okay, earlier 7 reasons why people object, and now it's 7 reasons Dave Paulson shared with us why we ought to study, okay, the 10 Commandments. Okay,
Which brings me to the first of the 7 reasons why we do study the 10 Commandments and why it's a help to do so. Number 1, it helps you to define sin. Now the preacher keeps using that funny little word. What does it mean? How do I know if I've got the disease? How do I know if I'm a sinner? Well, one very simple way to find out is to use the straight edge of God's law. How do you know if a wall is crooked? By just putting a straight edge against it. How do you know if a man is crooked? By just putting the law of God against him. Thank God for the law. Do you know that the 10 Commandments have brought many, many people to Christ? Have you ever noticed how often Dr. Billy Graham, when he's preaching, goes through the 10 Commandments? Why does he do that? Because he knows that until people feel crooked, they won't want to get straightened. He knows that until people realize they've got this dreadful killer disease of sin, they won't seek a cure in Christ. So he shows them the straight edge of God's law. It defines sin. Sin is not what the Sunday papers call sin. It's not what the film hoardings call sin. Sin is what God calls sin. And sin is a transgression of the law. And therefore, if you want to know if you've got the disease of sin, just sit down and read through the 10 Commandments and tick those you've kept. And put a cross against those you've broken. That'll tell you. It defines sin. It diagnoses our disease. And even after I have come to Christ, I still have problems with sin. There's my old self, what the Bible calls the flesh, still hanging around. And I need to know if I'm going to grow. I need to know what areas in my life still are being contaminated by the sin. How will I know that? By studying the straight edge of God's law. So whether I'm an unbeliever or a believer, it defines sin for me. Secondly, it helps me to receive guidance. I hope this won't shock you, but a man came to me and he told me to my face that he felt led by God to leave his wife and go and live with another woman. And he told me so sincerely that he'd prayed about it, that he'd thought about it, and that he was convinced God was telling him to do this. I was convinced straight away that God was not, because God doesn't contradict himself. There are 2 sorts of guidance we need. I'm going to call them general and particular. The general guidance into the will of God applies to every person in every situation, and therefore is general. It applies to the whole of life. The particular guidance is the will of God for me in these circumstances, in this place. Now, the 10 Commandments are concerned with general guidance. And what I want to say is this. I believe that some people have difficulty getting particular guidance because they are ignoring general guidance. In other words, if we are not already in line with the known God, we are not likely to get an answer to the unknown question of his will. Do you understand me? That my first condition to seeking particular guidance in a particular situation is to make quite sure I am generally in the will of God, that I'm doing his general will, that I'm loving him to the point of keeping his commandments. What right have I to ask him for particular guidance for me in this situation if I'm ignoring all that he's already told me to do? It helps us to receive guidance, the general guidance, on the basis of which God is then prepared to guide us particularly. Let me give you an illustration. I think God is far more interested in how we do our work than in what work we do. And yet I have had scores of young people come to me asking about this question of guidance regarding their work, and they're concerned with what they should do. Should I be a missionary? Should I be a butcher? Should I be a lawyer? Should I be what? And I want to say, look, God is far more interested in you being a good lawyer and a good butcher and a good missionary. The general guidance of God in the Bible is do your work to God's glory. And if a young person is not doing their work already to Christ's glory, whatever that work is, Why should they expect God to tell them what job he wants them to do if they're not even doing their existing job well? You see what I mean? The general guidance of the will of God first, the particular guidance second, and the Ten Commandments are the general guidance. We should make sure we've received that guidance before we ask for the next bit. Thirdly, it helps us to understand God. What kind of a person is God? Well, someone who reads the Ten Commandments will say, well, he's a killjoy for a start. He's the kind of God who, as soon as you enjoy yourself, says, thou shalt not. Like the little boy who went to school and was asked, what's your name? And he said, my name is Johnny Don't. That's what his mother always called him anyway. And the feeling is that the Ten Commandments show you the kind of God who sits up in heaven and says, someone's enjoying themselves on earth. Send a commandment straight away. Nothing could be further from the truth. I'll tell you what sort of a God the Ten Commandments reveal. A God who's got very high standards, for a start. Very high standards. A God who wants the best for people. A God who doesn't try and spoil your fun, but a God who says, you do that and it will spoil your fun. A God who says, if you want to enjoy life, I made it and here are my instructions for its use. If you want to get the best out of your life, out of your society, this is how it's to be run. It's a God who wants the best, who's revealed in the Ten Commandments. A God who is not content with anything less. So the Ten Commandments help us to understand God. Fourthly, the Ten Commandments help us to avoid suffering. There are two ways of gaining knowledge of evil. One is to listen to someone else, and the other is to do it yourself. And there is a tragic effect of knowing evil first-hand rather than second-hand. Thank God if you know evil second-hand. It'll save you a lot of suffering. That was the problem of the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden. God said, I don't want you to touch that because I don't want you to have first-hand knowledge of evil. I want you to take my word for it that there is evil and leave it there. Let me give you a down-to-earth illustration. Here is a young girl who's chaste. T-E at the end, I'm sorry, not E-D. She's chaste. She enjoys innocence. But she is a modern miss, and she says, you know, I'm not going to listen to my parents who say that chastity is right and unchastity is wrong. I'm going to find out for myself. I'm going to experience these things and come to my own conclusion. She will discover that unchastity is wrong, but she'll discover it the hard way, because one of the effects will be that she will no longer be able to enjoy innocence. Her knowledge of evil will be first-hand, but her knowledge of good will have become second-hand. Do you understand me? And she can't go back to the innocence. She can be forgiven, but she can't go back to innocence. That's a different thing. And God says, I don't want you to experience evil firsthand. I want you to take my word for it. I don't want you to face the suffering. I want you to have second-hand knowledge of evil and first-hand knowledge of good. And the Ten Commandments stand there to prevent people from having first-hand knowledge of evil and the loss of innocence, which they can never again enjoy once they have broken them. Fifthly, study of the Ten Commandments helps us to lift the level of our community life. The one thing our nation needs more than any other is law-abiding citizens. Not just those who abide by human laws, but those who abide by divine laws. That's what we're desperately needing. Our community is perishing for lack of people who recognize certain lines, certain standards, certain guidelines. And Jesus said, if you really act according to the guidelines, you will act as salt in the earth. And he meant, therefore, acting as a fertilizer and a disinfectant. These are the two uses of salt which he had in mind, as he explained. A fertilizer to promote the growth of what is good, and a disinfectant to limit the spread of evil. And he says, you can be salt, you can be salt. He said it just before he talked about not abolishing the law, but fulfilling it in the Sermon on the Mount. And if there were more people in our community who recognized the 10 Commandments, our social life would be transformed in this country. Sixthly, a study of the 10 Commandments will help you to guide your children. Let me paint for you two extremes. Here are two teenagers, we'll say. In the one home, everything is laid down the line. The mother and father are always making rules, as the quotation read earlier. You love building rules, or sandcastles. And so the father and mother say this, that, and the other. They've got it all laid down. The poor teenager is always having to come and go at the right time and all the rest of it. And there's a repression in that home, and the teenager says, and I've heard a girl say this to a mother, just you wait till I'm old enough to get out of this house. I'm going to have a flat of my own, get rid of you. I'm going to go away. And that kind of repressive home that's nothing but rules and regulations has a damaging effect on children. But at the other extreme, here's another teenager. Her parents don't care when she comes in. There are no rules. Here's the key. Get yourself some fish and chips. It's all free. And you know the interesting thing that psychologists have discovered, that this second teenager will feel dreadfully insecure, that it'll do harm to them, that in fact the freedom to do whatever they wish as children is in fact not the right thing, and will lead them to a deep insecurity. Funnily enough, teenagers appreciate it when parents have reasonable rules. They appreciate it deep down. It gives them a security because they know the limits within which they are free. And you damage a child on the one hand by having nothing but rules and regulations, on the other hand by having none. The security that comes into a Christian home where the parents are under the same rules as the children gives a child that guideline, that instinctive conscience that is going to help that child all through life to feel there is some security. That does not mean that a child accepts all the guidelines as interpreted by the parent. When a child grows up, he has to ask himself, were my parents right in saying that was wrong? And I myself have come to certain conclusions that are different from the moral judgments of my parents. But it's not an argument about the 10 Commandments. I knew that my parents recognized those just as much as I need to, and that we were all under certain clear guidelines. And seventhly, the 10 Commandments help us to please Jesus. Don't you want to do that if you're a Christian? Don't you want to please him? Then the answer is very simple. Jesus said, if you love me, keep my commandments. That's how you'll please me. That's how you'll show that you really love me. Jesus came to get the law done. He didn't come to get rid of it. He came to help people to do it. And nothing pleases the Lord more than those who show their love by keeping his commandments. You're saying to the Lord Jesus, I love you so much that your wish is my command.
I hope that been helpful to you, even as we going through the 10 Commandments, 7 good reasons why we ought to study the 10 Commandments, okay? And today we are focusing on Commandment 3 and 4. Commandment 3 and 4. I'm just going to read it from Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20, verse 7. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your maidservant or manservant or maidservant, nor your animals, nor the aliens within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that's in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Okay, this is where we are even for today. So this is important as we continue to study the 10 Commandments, that we keep this in mind. Okay, I like what another section that David Paulson says. The first commandment, you shall not misuse the name of the Lord. Okay, I think what Paulson is saying, the first commandment actually speaks to our heart. our heart. Okay. The second commandment don't have any image. Speaks to our hands, what we do with our hands. The third commandment, don't misuse the name of the Lord in vain. Speaks to our mouth. Okay, and I thought that was quite nice. Okay, means the commandment speaks to our heart, how we feel to have some other God. Second commandment, the image, what we make with our hands. Okay, and the third one, misuse the name of the Lord, a lot of time is to our mouth, to what we say. I think that's important for us to remember. Okay, and earlier, I think on Monday, one of our sisters asked us about OMG. Okay, you're not OMG. Okay, I said we will not use it. Okay, and we need to be very careful how we use God's name, directly and indirectly. Okay, I think that's important. At the same time, to keep the Sabbath day, okay, must understand there's a whole background. Jesus came to fulfill the law, and in the original 10 commandments, the Sabbath day to be kept, the day of rest, was very important to follow God's example. And God knows that man and his creation need the time of rest in order to recover and to be strengthened. And in the Old Testament, you have some very clear rules. You cannot cook, you cannot light a fire and all that. What happened when you go on in the Old Testament, in the Jewish scribes and Pharisees, they started to interpret what is work, started to give definition what is work. How far can you walk on the Sabbath? Apparently, if you go to some part of Israel, very strict Jewish people, they have poles all around a kibbutz where they stay. Poles. Okay, I think 2,000 yards, I'm not mistaken. Okay, so on the Sabbath day, that's for them is Friday 6 o'clock to Saturday 6 p.m. Okay, you cannot walk past that pole on the Sabbath day. You are breaking the law. They can't so strict. Okay, and you can't even do any good on the Sabbath. Okay, they say you can't even look at the mirror, because you look at the mirror just in case you see a gray hair and you pull out the gray hair. That's work. Okay, so they become very legalistic. They say you cannot take an egg of a chicken laid on the Sabbath. Why? Because the chicken broke the law by working on the Sabbath by laying an egg. So you cannot eat the egg. So they become very legalistic in all these aspects. And because of that, okay, Jesus, you notice throughout Jesus' life, a lot of his miracles happen on the Sabbath. I think he purposely want to heal on the Sabbath to say that God's law is to help people, not to be a burden on them. And but the tradition of the scribes and the Pharisees, the Sadducees, all that, make a burden on the people, so that keeping the Sabbath became a legalistic tradition and not one to give the actual rest. You are so worried you don't break any of these laws. So even now you go to Israel, on the Sabbath, you cannot even press the leave button. Okay, you press the leave button, there's work. So the leaf on the Sabbath will stop at every flow. In Israel today even. That's how legalistic people become when they define work. So it's good for us to know that in the freedom that we have in Jesus, Jesus still asks us to keep the Sabbath, but with the right spirit. The Sabbath should set us free, should allow us to do what is good and not be a burden to press us down. I think that's important, okay? And I mean, when I became a doctor and all that, people ask, hey, Christian, Sabbath, you rest, cannot work one. Okay, so I mean, it's the idea that we are doing good. So when I go on call the Sabbath, which I have done many times, we work. Okay, and that's helping people, helping life, and not seen as breaking a Sabbath. So I think it's important for us to understand that God's 10 commandments are not there to be a burden on us, but a good yardstick, a good guideline for you and I to live a life that as we set the boundaries right, then we have the freedom to know what standards to keep, what standards we should have, and not only help us, but also help our children and grandchildren. I think that's important. So as we study the 10 commandments, don't see it as a legalistic burden on man, but one that sets the guideline to help us to determine what is right and what is wrong. And those are absolutes, not up for debate, for discussion. Right and wrong is there, and we must live within the framework of God's rule and regulation. So I hope that's helpful to us. Okay,